Hi, this is Pastor Ryan. We're recording the first video for our digital reading group, reading Luther's Babylonian Captivity of the Church. Just a few things about the version that you're reading. So here's the one I'm reading. Yours will look a little different because this is from one of the volumes that it came from, and yours is just an excerpt from the volume. And these volumes came out 2017 or so, and they took a few years. There's 5 or 6 of them. None of that really matters. It came out of Augsburg, different translators and stuff. What matters is this little annotated Luther thing, and that's why we chose this version, because I've talked about this. Reading Luther is a bit like going scuba diving. I've never done it, but I understand that when you're scuba diving, you can't just go deep really fast. You got to take time and let your body get acclimated. Otherwise, you get the bends, as it's called. And the thing about Luther is he's always kind of there at the bottom of the sea and getting acclimated to what he's talking about, his assumptions. It's really hard. He lives in a different world. He's more acquainted with the Bible and the tradition of the church than any of us, frankly, will ever be. So it's a lot of work. So what's nice about this annotated Luther is you don't have to necessarily do all that work. These notes will help you. And so I would always like you to read the notes. They're going to be extremely helpful as you work your way through this different document. So I'll just say that's enough of that for now. It took me quite a long time to get acclimated to Luther, and to be honest, it wasn't even until after seminary. So I really would like to encourage us to read the notes. So what I'm going to do is just at the beginning to kind of talk about a few things to get you started before you read, and knowing you all, probably some of you have already started, but the Babylonian Captivity was written in 1520. Now, for context, in 1517, Luther wrote the 95 Theses. That's why we usually date the Reformation from 1517 onward. And, I think that his more refined, what the Lutheran tradition is about, really doesn't kind of come out full force until a year later, 1518, the Heidelberg Disputation. But that doesn't matter. It's just to say that he's writing 3 years after the 95 Theses. Now, at this point, we know it's put out a whole controversy and stuff, but he hasn't been excommunicated. It's actually coming at this point, and he's heard rumors that it's coming. But 1520 is very important because at this point, he's written the 95 Theses, and he's calling for reform. And in the Heidelberg, when he puts out this theological program and showing that it's not originating with him, that he's looking to Augustine and what the biblical writers say, he's staking out the legitimacy of this tradition. And as this goes along, it's galvanizing in both directions. The people who were sympathetic to what Luther said and then became convinced of this cause got together on this side, and those who were opposed kind of got stronger along this side. And so what's happening at this point is kind of an irreparable breach. In fact, if you read your notes in there, it'll mention someone, Erasmus, who says that, and we can talk about him when we get there. And in 1520, as this is happening, Luther writes 3 really important documents. Really good Lutheran historians will say it was more than 3 documents. He really wrote 5. But the 3 big ones was the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, also Luther's Freedom of the Christian, and then his other one is Address to the Christian Nobility. And just quickly, Address to the Christian Nobility is Luther seeing that this reform in the church needs to happen. The church leadership itself isn't doing it, so how's it going to happen? And Luther called on the princes of this time to say, you've got to be the ones to do this because our church leaders have fallen down on the job. So you can see how this breach between the church that Luther's a part of and what he's talking about, that it's growing. Freedom of the Christian is Luther just laying down this evangelical freedom that he talks about, this justification by grace and what it means for Christian life. And that's a really great book as well. But we're reading Babylonian Captivity. And this one is Luther talking about the 7 sacraments of the church. And we don't really call them sacraments very often anymore. We have 2. baptism and communion. But what Luther's point is that the prevailing practices and the way the authorities had structured how they could and could not be used had become a kind of captivity to normal people like us, and that you had to play for the piper, otherwise you were just out. And so what Luther wants to do is two things. He wants to show how what's been added to the sacraments is all just human adding stuff, and Luther cutting them down isn't doing anything new. He's actually going back to the Bible, and all the stuff that's been added to it, he says, is just human stuff that's been added. And the trouble with that, whether it's added or not, who really cares? But the trouble is, it hasn't been anything that's helped us get to this grace that God offers. So first he wants to show the trouble that's been caused by adding all these things, and then he wants to show what God's really up to in the sacraments. Let me review my notes really quick. Okay, so that's more or less the gist of what I want to talk that Luther is up to. What he's going to do is, there were 7 at the time. He's going to say there's 3, and then by the time he gets done, he's going to say, you know what, actually there's only 2. And it's because of the criteria that he lays out for what makes a sacrament a sacrament. And actually the criteria is not his, it's the traditional definition that goes back to Augustine. And the definition of a sacrament is a visible word. So obviously you can't see words. The visible word is something, in the sacraments, is the bread and wine in communion. You can see them. You can also touch them, taste them, and then in baptism it's water. So, because the other sacraments didn't have any kind of attached thing to it, Luther said they just can't be. Now that's not his only criteria. For him, it also has to be commanded by God, by Jesus specifically. It has to be commanded, and if it's not commanded, then it's just another thing. And the ones that there's a command to them is to baptize, go and baptize all the nations. Communion, do this in remembrance of me, that they have commands attached to them, and not just commands, but also promises. And for Luther, unless they meet these criteria, then they're not sacraments. They may be good, but it's not a sacrament. And because sacraments are essential, because they are the things that the church defines themselves about, getting clarity on them is going to be very important for Luther. So that's kind of the gist of it. Now, as you see, we're studying this because we're missing communion and we're wondering about, could there be other ways to have it? And you're going to see that that question is a really practical question. And by going and reading Luther, we're getting to the real deep stuff. So I thank you for hanging with me in this. I think it'll be rewarding. It's been for me, and I'm really looking forward to reading this with you. So for your homework now at this point, is all I want you to do is read the translator's introduction. I believe that should be just pages 9 through 12, and I want you to read all the notes. And that's it, and it's going to kind of give you a feel. In fact, let's add just a little bit more to it. Let's add Luther's introduction, which is only pages 13 through 15. So the whole thing is just pages 9 through 15. And because it's really easy, and because we're kind of going to figure it out. And so one, it's going to get you familiar with reading the notes. And I want you to do that, please. And then you're going to read the translator's introduction, and that's going to give you some more context. And it'll touch on some things I've talked about. And you're going to feel like, okay, I feel oriented. I'm not totally lost here. And then also reading Luther's introduction is going to give you a bit of a familiarity with the way that he speaks. So that's why we're going to choose that. Now here's the other thing though. It's a short assignment, because what I'd like you to do before, let's say Monday afternoon. So this is going to get uploaded Tuesday on the 5th. And before that Monday afternoon, have read that and submit to me any questions you have, because we only have this one direction. And so you can write the questions, and if you don't want me to say, oh, so-and-so wondered this, just say, don't say I'm the one who asked this question, and I won't do that. But I want to give you enough time to read it and come up with any questions, and by any we mean any, because there's no dumb questions. So, for instance, it's going to talk about penance. That's not something we say these days. You may or may not be familiar with what that is. So you might read that, wonder what is penance. You can look up on the internet penance, and you're going to find a lot of definitions. And of course, the one we're interested in is what Luther means when he uses this word. So so write down any questions you have, okay, and submit them by Monday noon, and that'll give me time in the video that I record that I'll say, here's what everyone's thinking. Those are the most important things. If you have any insights, observations, whatever. And then next week we'll put out one talking about this, and we might even try to schedule when we'll do the chat, and then we can record it for people who can't be there during this one, because we know it's really kind of tricky to get everyone's schedules together. The last thing I'm going to say as far as getting oriented and everything, and this is the 11-minute mark, it's kind of the last hidden thing. So getting oriented to Luther, the way he talks, the way he thinks, and the notes. There's going to be a note in there. It's the very first note. It's a bit of a long one, and the word is a German word, Anfechtung. I'm not even quite saying that right. And it's going to give a bit of a definition for what it is. And then at the end, it's going to say something about this, how Luther came to understand it. And I'm telling you, it's quite different. It's not the way we think. And this upside down way that Luther goes at what it means to be a Christian, when you can start to let him turn your world upside down, what he's saying, the rest of it's going to fall into place. It won't be quite as much of a challenge. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Luther has always been someone who I think you'll come to be quite fond of. And so I'm excited to read this with you, excited to hear what you come across and what questions you have, which things surprised you. So, Monday by noon, let's say, do that, so that gives me enough time to think about it and kind of put together what you want to hear. And then this Anfechtung note, I'm really interested to see. I don't want to show my cards here or anything like that. So that's everything. I wish you blessings on it. As you can tell, I'm really excited about going over this with you. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for taking it up, for rising to the challenge. So that's it. I look forward to this. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.